beneath one of the most densely populated regions in America, hidden under freeways and rail lines and the homes of millions of sleeping people, there is a crack in the earth that scientists have quietly nicknamed a tectonic time bomb. It does not run out in some distant wilderness. It runs directly through the heart of the San Francisco Bay Area, threading beneath cities, neighborhoods, schools, hospitals, and an estimated 2 million homes. And here is the part that should stop everyone who lives above it cold. This fault has a rhythm, a pattern of rupturing at regular intervals that scientists have traced back through history, and by that rhythm, it is now overdue. The last time it unleashed a major earthquake was roughly a century and a half ago, and the clock has been ticking ever since. Most people who live in the Bay Area think of the great, famous fault when they think of earthquakes, the long, legendary boundary that runs along the edge of the region and produced the disaster that burned San Francisco long ago. But there is another fault, less famous, but in many ways more menacing to the millions who live above it, precisely because of where it runs. This one does not stay out at the coast or offshore. It cuts straight through the most heavily developed urban ground in the entire region, so that an astonishing number of people live not just near it, but directly on top of it. When it ruptures, and it will, the earthquake will begin right underfoot, in the middle of one of the most crowded landscapes in the country. In this video, we are going to explore this hidden and dangerous fault in depth. We will look at exactly where it runs and why it threads through such densely populated ground, why scientists describe it as overdue, and what that unsettling word really means, and what would happen when it finally lets go beneath the millions of homes above it. We will examine the particular dangers it poses, from the tearing of the ground to the failure of the lifelines that cross it, and we will consider what the people who live on top of this restless seam can do to prepare. Stay with me to the end, because understanding this fault and the countdown that has already begun changes the way you see the ground beneath one of America's great urban regions. Hashtag the fault that cuts through the cities. To understand the danger, you first have to understand where this fault actually runs, because its location is the single most important and most frightening thing about it. Most major faults, even active and dangerous ones, run through relatively open country, along mountain fronts, through valleys, or out beneath the sea. This one is different. It runs directly through the built-up urban core of the region, threading beneath a long string of densely populated cities, one after another, in an almost continuous line of development. Imagine a fault that passes beneath residential neighborhoods, under apartment buildings and single-family homes, beneath schools and universities, beneath hospitals and shopping centers and busy roads. That is exactly the situation here. The fault does not skirt the edges of the population. It goes straight through the middle of it. In some places, its path is marked by subtle features in the landscape, a line of hills, an offset curb, a crack in a wall, that betray its presence to those who know what to look for. It even passes directly beneath a famous stadium, which has been slowly and visibly torn apart over the years by the fault's constant creeping movement. One of the most dramatic illustrations anywhere of a major structure built squarely across a living fault. This is why the fault matters so much and why it is so dangerous. When a fault runs through wilderness, its rupture is a geological event witnessed by almost no one. When a fault runs through the heart of a metropolitan area, home to millions, its rupture is a human catastrophe of the first order. The people who live above this fault are not spectators to its danger. They are directly in its path, living on the very ground that will one day tear and heave when the fault finally releases the strain it has been storing for generations. An estimated 2 million homes sit within reach of its most intense effects, and countless lives are bound up in what happens when it moves. Hashtag what overdue really means. Now we come to the word that makes this fault so alarming, the word overdue, because it is not used loosely here. It is grounded in a pattern that scientists have painstakingly reconstructed from the history and the geology of the fault, and understanding that pattern is the key to understanding the danger. Great faults like this one do not rupture at random. They tend to follow a rough rhythm, building up strain over a period of time, releasing it in a major earthquake, and then beginning the process all over again. By studying the physical evidence left behind by past earthquakes, digging into the ground to read the layers of disturbed earth, scientists can estimate how often this fault has produced major ruptures over the centuries. What they have found is sobering. This fault has a history of producing major earthquakes at intervals averaging somewhere in the range of a century and a half, give or take. And the last major earthquake it produced struck roughly a century and a half ago, in the era when the region was still young and far less populated than it is today. Do the arithmetic, and the conclusion is unavoidable. The amount of time that has passed since the last rupture has now reached, and in a sense exceeded, the typical interval between them. In the language of the scientists who study it, the fault is at or past the point where the next major earthquake would, on average, be expected. It is overdue. Now, overdue does not mean the earthquake is scheduled for a particular day, and it is important to be honest about that. Faults do not run on precise timetables, and the intervals between ruptures vary. The next great earthquake could come tomorrow, or it could hold off for years or even decades longer. But the fundamental point stands, and it is a chilling one. The strain that drives this fault has been accumulating without release for about as long as it typically takes to build toward a major rupture. Every year that passes without an earthquake is not a year of growing safety. It is another year of energy loaded into the fault, another turn of the screw, making the eventual release more certain and potentially more violent. The people living above it are not waiting for a distant hypothetical. They are living on borrowed time above a fault that by its own long-established rhythm is ready. Hashtag why this fault is so dangerous. The combination of an overdue fault and a location beneath millions of homes is dangerous enough on its own, but there are specific features of this fault and the ground around it that make the threat even more severe. Understanding these dangers explains why scientists regard a rupture here as one of the most serious earthquake threats facing the country. The first and most obvious danger is the shaking. When the fault ruptures, it will release an enormous amount of stored energy, sending powerful seismic waves radiating outward through the ground. Because the fault runs directly beneath such a densely populated area, the most intense shaking would strike the most crowded ground, with little of the distance that would normally weaken the waves before they reach people. The earthquake would originate right beneath the homes and buildings, delivering its full force to structures directly above the rupture. And in a great earthquake, the shaking does not last for a few brief seconds, but can roll on for a punishing stretch of time, long enough to bring down buildings that survived the first jolt. The second danger is surface rupture, the tearing of the ground itself along the line of the fault. Because so many homes, roads, pipelines, and rail lines are built directly across the fault, the sudden sideways movement of the ground when it ruptures could physically split them apart, tearing structures in two as the two sides of the fault slide past each other. This is a danger unique to those built right on the fault line, and here that line runs beneath an extraordinary amount of development. The third danger comes from the lifelines that cross the fault. A modern region depends on an invisible web of infrastructure: water pipelines, gas lines, electrical lines, roads, bridges, and rail systems. And in this region, a great many of those critical lifelines cross directly over the fault. When the ground ruptures, it could sever them all at once, cutting water, gas, and power, breaking transportation links, and crippling the systems the region depends on precisely when they are needed most. Broken gas lines raise the specter of fire, and broken water mains would leave firefighters struggling to respond. And beneath parts of the region lie soft, water-saturated soils and filled ground that can amplify the shaking and even lose their strength entirely, causing the ground to fail beneath the structures on top of it. Taken together, these dangers make a rupture here a threat not just of a strong earthquake, but of a wide-reaching disaster. Hashtag the silent creep there is one more feature of this fault that is both fascinating and deeply unsettling, and it sets this fault apart from many others. In places, it does not stay perfectly still between earthquakes. Instead, it creeps, slowly and continuously, the two sides of the fault inching past each other year after year in a quiet, relentless motion that can be measured and, in some places, even seen with the naked eye. This creep leaves visible marks across the landscape for those who know where to look. Curbs are slowly offset, so that a straight line of concrete develops a gradual bend. Walls and fences built across the fault are pulled apart over time. Roads develop cracks that must be repeatedly repaired. The famous stadium built across the fault has been visibly deformed, its structure slowly torn by the ground moving beneath it. These are not the dramatic ruptures of an earthquake, but the patient, ceaseless motion of a fault that is alive and moving even in the quiet years. In one sense, this creep might seem reassuring, as if the fault were gently releasing its energy a little at a time rather than storing it for a violent release. But that is not the full picture, and this is what makes the creep so unsettling. The creep is a constant physical reminder that the fault is active, that it is moving, that it is real and present beneath the feet of the people who live above it. It is a preview, in slow motion, of the sudden and violent movement that a major earthquake would bring all at once. The fault is not sleeping, it is awake, and it is moving every single day, slowly bending the world above it, biding its time until the moment it lets go completely. Hashtag, when it finally ruptures, let us imagine, as clearly and honestly as we can, what would actually happen when this fault finally ruptures beneath the millions of homes above it, because the reality is sobering, and it is the reason understanding this danger matters so much. The earthquake would begin without warning, deep beneath the crowded urban ground, and the energy would reach the surface almost instantly, because there is no distance to travel when the fault is directly underfoot. In the first moments, the shaking would strike the densely populated cities along the fault with tremendous force. Buildings would sway, and in the hardest hit areas and among the most vulnerable structures, some would fail. Older buildings, and those built before modern earthquake standards, would be at the greatest risk. Directly along the fault line, the ground itself could tear and shift, splitting roads and rupturing anything built across it. The shaking would radiate outward across the entire region, striking not just the cities on the fault, but the wider metropolitan area, one of the most populous in the country. Then would come the cascade of consequences. The lifelines crossing the fault could be severed, cutting water, gas, and power across broad areas. Fires could ignite from broken gas lines, and with water mains ruptured, firefighters could find themselves fighting flames with too little water, a scenario that has turned earthquakes into infernos before. Transportation could be crippled as roads, bridges, and rail lines are damaged, making it hard for help to reach the hardest hit areas and hard for people to move to safety. In areas of soft ground, buildings could sink and tilt as the soil fails. And the sheer number of people affected, across a region of millions, would overwhelm emergency services, so that in the crucial early hours, many people would be left to rely on themselves and their neighbors. The aftermath could stretch on for a very long time. Restoring the severed lifelines, especially the water system, could take an extended period, leaving communities to cope without normal services. The economic disruption to one of the most important regions in the country would be immense, rippling far beyond the area itself. This is not a minor tremor. It is the kind of event that reshapes a region, and it waits beneath the ground that millions call home. Hashtag, the earthquake the region forgot to understand why scientists are so certain this fault can produce a devastating earthquake. You only have to look to its last major rupture, an event that struck about a century and a half ago, and that, at the time, was so severe it was regarded as one of the great earthquakes in the region's history. In that era, before the region had grown into the vast metropolis it is today, the fault let go in a powerful earthquake that caused serious damage across the young communities of the area, toppling buildings, cracking the ground, and taking lives. For a time, it held the grim distinction of being the most destructive earthquake the region had known. But then, history intervened. A later, even more famous earthquake on the Great Coastal Fault struck the region and became seared into the public memory, so overwhelming in its destruction that it eclipsed the earlier event almost entirely. Over the generations, the memory of that earlier rupture faded, slipping out of the public consciousness even as the population swelled and spread directly across the very fault that had produced it. Today, most of the millions who live above this fault have no idea that it has already devastated the region once before, that the ground they live on has ruptured violently within recorded history and will do so again, that forgetting is itself a danger. When the memory of a disaster fades, so does the sense of urgency to prepare for it. The fault that struck once and was forgotten did not become any less dangerous in the meantime. On the contrary, in the long years since that last rupture, the region grew from a scattering of young towns into one of the most densely populated and economically vital areas in the entire country, packing millions of people and homes directly onto the fault. The danger did not shrink as the memory faded. It grew enormously, even as the awareness of it dimmed. The earthquake the region forgot is precisely the one it most needs to remember. Hashtag 2 million homes in the path. It is worth pausing to truly absorb the scale of what is at stake, because the number attached to this fault is staggering. An estimated 2 million homes lie within reach of the most intense effects of a rupture on this fault, and behind each of those homes are the people who live in them, the families, the children, the elderly. The whole fabric of ordinary life spread out directly across the danger zone. This is not a fault threatening a remote outpost or a thinly settled stretch of countryside. It runs beneath one of the great concentrations of population and prosperity in the nation. Think about what 2 million homes really represents. It is entire cities' worth of neighborhoods, block after block, community after community, stretching along the line of the fault and spreading out into the wider region that the shaking would reach. It is schools full of children, hospitals full of patients, workplaces full of people, all sitting atop or beside a fault that is overdue to rupture. It is a density of human life and human infrastructure that turns any major earthquake here from a natural event into a profound humanitarian and economic emergency. And this scale is exactly why the stakes are so high and why preparation matters so much. The more people and homes that sit in the path of a fault, the greater the potential toll, but also the greater the number of lives that thoughtful preparation can protect. 2 million homes at risk is a frightening number, but it is also 2 million opportunities to strengthen a building, to make a family plan, to store supplies, to be ready. The scale of the danger is matched by the scale of what can be done to blunt it. If the people living above the fault choose to act while there is still time. Hashtag living above the time bomb it would be easy to hear all of this and feel a sense of dread, but that is not the purpose of understanding this danger, and it is not the right response. The great value of knowing about this fault and knowing that it is overdue is that it turns an invisible, ignored threat into something that can be prepared for. And preparation, more than anything else, is what determines how a community comes through a great earthquake. These cities are not doomed. Their fate is not sealed. What happens when the fault finally moves depends enormously on the choices made in the years before. Enormous effort has gone into making the region more resilient. Buildings have been strengthened, and programs have pushed to reinforce the older, most vulnerable structures most likely to fail. Critical infrastructure has been upgraded and, in places, designed to bend and flex across the fault rather than simply break. Bridges have been retrofitted. Emergency plans have been developed and drilled. Every one of these efforts changes the story of what happens when the earthquake comes, reducing the toll and saving lives. The knowledge that the fault is overdue is precisely what has driven so much of this work, turning a frightening fact into a spur for action. For individuals, the knowledge is power in the most direct and practical way. If you live above or near this fault, understanding the danger changes how you prepare. It means securing your home, knowing how to protect yourself when the shaking starts by dropping, taking cover, and holding on. It means keeping enough water, food, and supplies to last not a day or two, but a week or more, because in a disaster of this scale, help may be slow to arrive, and the lifelines may be down for an extended time. It means having a plan for your family, knowing how you will reconnect if you are separated, and understanding the specific risks of the ground you live on. The people who come through a great earthquake best are always those who understood their danger in advance and prepared for it. The fault beneath these cities will move again. That much is written into the very rock, into the long rhythm of ruptures that stretches back through the centuries. The strain has been building for about as long as it takes, and the countdown has already begun. Millions of people live above it. The wisest thing any of them can do is to respect the danger, to prepare while there is still time, and to support the ongoing work of making their cities stronger. Because when a tectonic time bomb has been counting down for a century and a half, the only question left is not whether it will go off, but whether the people living above it will be ready when it does. The ground has kept its rhythm for thousands of years. It will not break that rhythm now, and the time to prepare is not after